So now we're going to move. We're running a little bit over, but that's okay. We're going to go through the questions that we've received in chat. And I know there's several feeds, so I'm just going to read the questions and I'll prompt the researchers to answer them. So our first couple questions are for Alana Welms. So one of the questions is, will 4C, the trial, only enroll patients who have experienced their first metastatic recurrence from early stage or de novo disease, or will it include patients who have experienced failure of metastatic treatment regimen?
Yeah, so that's a little bit complicated question. It depends on, so 4C is a very small study, only 15 patients. It's a feasibility study to make sure we can make the organoids from the metastatic biopsies, get it and find out if we can get drug recommendations. And we're actually interrogating the physicians. So we're doing informed consent of the physicians so that we can ask them to take surveys to figure out whether or not the information we provide actually influences their treatment decisions. So because it's so small, we're really focusing it on first metastatic recurrence in triple negative breast cancer or progression of ER positive disease after all hormone therapy combinations are exhausted. So it's a needed window, but we're trying to keep it kind of uniform so that with a small data set, we can ask about feasibility.
Got it. Okay, great. I guess the next question is, I mean, it's more around, CTC and biology, but Dolores, Peter, Alana, either one of you chime in, but we can start with Peter first. So one of the questions was, for those whose tumor markers are unreliable, would it be likely that CTCs may not be present in blood samples? And is there a correlation between CTC availability and tumor markers?
I'm going to start answering this question in a research use only context. It's really important now to differentiate between what we call clinical care and research use only. And Dolores briefly mentioned as well that she is readying her work to be deployed in a CLIA lab, which would mean that it could actually be used, start being used for decision making, which again is what we have done in prostate. So it's really important to separate out what we do as research findings versus what could be used in the clinical setting, because this question is a very specific question in that regard. Tumor markers are always difficult. Biomarkers are always difficult because they are so much dependent on the disease and the therapeutic pressure. And us understanding how they go up and down is really the key challenge that we have to overcome, which is exactly why in this third generation approach, the attempt is really to look at all possible biomarkers of the tumor. So not just one, right? So this is where you see people like Dolores and ourselves actually collaborating, right? Because we want to make sure that we look at oncosomes, as well as CTCs, as well as circulating tumor DNA, as well as, honestly, all of the traditional biomarkers, because there will be cases where one of them will be giving us a very telling story, whereas the other one isn't. So there's always advantages and disadvantages when you think of these biomarkers. If they're all available, then then you pick whatever is best to make the decision. But oftentimes, some of them might not be available for a particular reason in that particular setting for the patient. So I know that this is not a satisfying answer because it's not a yes/no answer, but that really reflects of why biomarker development, tumor marker development is just as complicated as drug development and has to be taken with the same rigor in terms of clinical trials as we would do in drug development as well, because of course we want to support very direct decision making for the patients.
Thank you. So, I'm going to ask a couple, two more questions. Are there any open / enrolling liquid biopsy trials for metastatic patients who have no evidence of disease? I think, Peter or Alana, I don't believe it, that there are any.
So no, and part of this question that is being raised is actually a broad question as well, right? Because and we talk about this, every week. Actually, I had a conversation about this yesterday. Hey, Peter, if resources would not be an issue, how would you support breast cancer patients? What's the trial that you would actually run? And I said, oh, straightforward. Anybody who has ever gotten an Oncotype DX done, offer them to participate in a overtime trial, because that is what we need to study, right? So the good news for that patient with no evidence of disease is, of course, that, well, no evidence of disease means that there is nothing clinically visible. So when we go subclinical, meaning something that we might be able to see in the blood, we would love to follow a group of patients like that, right? To prove whether or not we can identify recurrence early, and if we intervene early, whether we can improve that patient's life. And in order to do that, we have to do this as these larger scale trials, which are so desperately needed and really need to be open for patients around the country. And which is what I said in the very beginning when I said, in the post-outbreak world, one thing that I think that opened our eyes to is that remote patient enrollment, remote patient consenting, it's all entirely doable. So I really hope that as a scientific community together, and when I say scientific community, I include all patients in this because you're a huge driver, that we can really move forward with this.
Okay, great. And I think, yeah, I agree. I think, when patients, we say no evidence of disease, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It's just we don't have those thresholds, right, to look at the cells, on a, we do have the threshold, but it's not so finite and refined right now to see it, on that space. So, and the way I always the analogy I always use is TV resolutions, right? So the higher resolution we get, the more we could see, and the more we can find, that needle in the haystack. The last questions, and I'll let go because we're going to be short on, we're running over onto the other panel, is, there's this question that's been asked is there a case to biopsy metastasis when possible? And if it can be different from the primary tumor? And yes, that is the case. We need to have more, as far as Alana's trial goes, from the point of view of Peter and Dolores's research, we need to get the metastatic tissue. We need to find out, take those out, biopsy them, so that we can compare. Remember what initially Danny and I talked about. There is a difference of the primary versus metastasis, and there are the different marbles that go hand in hand, and we need to figure out how is that tumor evolving. And so in most cases, it's more important to know the metastatic tissue landscape than it is the primary, because tumor cells have evolved and now there's treatment resistant going. So that is the goal, and I hope that we've conveyed that to you in this first session for this morning / afternoon. And so with that, I really want to thank Danny, Alana, Peter, and Dolores, really for fantastic talks and updating us on their research and where the field of metastatic breast cancer research goes. I'm sure all of the patients and participants out there are really thankful for your participation. And so with that, I want to thank you, and I hope you guys enjoy your afternoon, or Alana, your late afternoon in Utah. And
I'm gonna listen to the rest of the talks.
Okay, so if you're staying, great.
Josh, thank you, Josh. I saw the lineup, listening to Saul and Pat and everybody who was lined up in the afternoon. I'm definitely staying on.
Yeah. Okay, good. So